High in the Andes, there is a stone complex built along a narrow ridge, surrounded by deep valleys and constant rain. Building walls here would already be difficult. Keeping them stable for centuries is what truly fascinates researchers. Machu Picchu does not impress only because of what rises along the slopes. Its greatest secret may lie in what was built beneath the surface. Before we step into the engineering that reshaped the mountain itself, like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. Building at this point in the Andes meant facing several problems at once. The ridge is narrow, the ground is uneven, and the altitude makes any continuous labor more exhausting. On top of that, mountain rain encourages seepage, erosion, and instability along the slopes. So the challenge was not simply raising walls in a high place. It was creating a base strong enough to withstand weight, water, and time on sloping ground. Even before the visible architecture, the builders had to understand how the mountain behaved. This is where Machu Picchu begins to astonish, not because of the look of the ruins, but because of the decision to build in a place where almost everything worked against permanence. Machu Picchu did not appear in isolation. It was built by a society that had already mastered roads, stairways, suspension bridges, and movement across different elevations. In a vast and mountainous territory, that accumulated knowledge made it possible to organize labor, resources, and travel with remarkable efficiency. Even without iron, and without an alphabetic writing system, there was real engineering experience shaped by the terrain. That helps explain how such a difficult project could even be planned. Machu Picchu represents an extreme point of that capability. It was not born from improvisation, but from a building tradition forged in demanding environments. To understand the site, we have to see it as part of a much larger Andean system of knowledge about land, altitude, and collective organization. Many scholars understand Machu Picchu as closely tied to the ruling elite and to the period of Inca expansion. The site is often described as a complex with residential, ceremonial, agricultural, and administrative functions. Its position offered isolation, sweeping visibility over the surrounding landscape, and powerful natural protection. At the same time, the location also made sense within the sacred Andean world, where mountains, rocks, and waterways carried deep meaning. Building here was not just a practical decision. It also expressed power, planning, and a relationship with the land itself. Machu Picchu seems to have brought together, in one place, political value, symbolic value, and technical mastery. That combination helps explain why the city was established in such a difficult setting. Machu Picchu was not simply dropped on top of a mountain. The complex was planned in dialogue with the rocky ridge, with the changes in elevation, and with the natural path of water. Walls, stairways, terraces, and channels follow the terrain instead of trying to erase it. That adaptation helped reduce risk, organize movement, and make better use of the most stable areas of the slope. The surrounding landscape was also part of the design. Both because of visibility and because of the cultural meaning carried by those mountains. That is why understanding Machu Picchu requires looking at architecture and terrain at the same time. The shape of the city grows out of the mountain, and that is exactly what makes the site still feel, even today, both improbable and perfectly coherent. For centuries, Machu Picchu remained beyond the knowledge of the outside world. When it began drawing attention again in the early 20th century, much of the site was still covered by vegetation and moisture. Even so, stairways, terraces, enclosures, and stone walls emerged clearly enough to reveal the scale of the complex. the impact was immediate. This was not simply a set of ancient ruins high in the mountains, but a vast work carefully integrated into the ridge itself. That rediscovery made visible a major technical achievement, hidden for a long time among mist, rain, and steep slopes. From that point on, Machu Picchu was seen not only as a breathtaking landscape, but as a major historical and engineering question. When the site began to be studied more closely, some elements stood out right away. Stairways cut into stone, sequences of terraces, narrow passageways, and clearly defined sectors showed that this was not a random collection of ruins. There was a clear spatial order and a layout carefully adjusted to the mountain ridge. The finer walls stood out because of the precision of their fit, but what impressed people most was the coherence of the whole. Everything seemed to answer the same question. How do you build and maintain a functional complex on sloping, wet, unstable ground? Machu Picchu was beginning to reveal that its greatest strength did not lie in one isolated technique, but in the integration of many solutions working together. Construction began with selecting the right stone. The builders worked mainly with local granite, using material available in the surrounding mountains. That helped reduce part of the logistical burden, which was essential in such a remote place. Not every stone required the same finish. Some were shaped more precisely for more refined sectors, while others served structural or retaining functions. That difference reveals a project organized by priority and purpose. Even so, using nearby material did not make the process easy. Extracting blocks, separating usable pieces, and beginning the shaping process on sloping ground was still a difficult task. Before the city could rise, the mountain's rock had to be turned into a controlled building element. Transporting stone at Machu Picchu was as great a challenge as cutting it. Without wheels and without heavy draft animals, movement likely depended on plant fiber ropes, levers, ramps, and carefully prepared paths. On a narrow slope, the goal was not speed, but control. Any mistake could damage the block, the route, and the safety of the workers themselves. The terrain demanded constant attention to moisture, friction, and support points along the climb. That shows us that transport was part of the engineering, not just an act of brute strength. Each block had to conquer the mountain's incline before reaching its place of use. At Machu Picchu, moving stone meant planning the route with the same precision devoted to the final walls. A project on this scale required far more than technical skill. Tasks had to be coordinated, resources had to be distributed, and work had to keep moving at high altitude, where fatigue is greater and the margin for error is smaller. While some groups extracted stone, others transported material, maintained paths, organized supplies, or prepared construction sectors. That system depended on constant circulation and on a division of labor carefully adjusted to the terrain. Nothing at Machu Picchu suggests improvisation. On the contrary, the site points to collective planning with multiple stages unfolding at the same time. The city began to exist before it was finished, in the form of routes, support systems, and coordinated activity. The visible engineering was only possible because the logistics behind the labor worked with real efficiency. After transport came a decisive stage, the fine-tuning of the stone. In many sectors, blocks were shaped gradually, until they achieved an exceptionally precise fit. This work was not only about creating a visually striking effect. It helped improve the balance of the structure, distribute weight, and integrate each piece into the behavior of the whole. The result is masonry that looks simple from a distance, but reveals extraordinary technical control up close. At Machu Picchu, precision was not luxury. It was part of the solution. And as we move toward the most important secret of this engineering, take a moment to like the video and stay with me through the next sections. The terraces of Machu Picchu did not serve agriculture alone. They had an essential structural function on a mountain exposed to rain and erosion. These platforms helped hold back soil, distribute weight, create levels for movement, and control how water flowed down the slope. In terrain like this, turning the mountain into stable steps was an engineering necessity before it was an agricultural solution. Cultivation was part of the system, but it does not explain everything. The terraces also acted as retaining and stabilizing structures for the land itself. That helps explain why they appear across so many areas of the site. At Machu Picchu, the landscape was reorganized into functional layers, so the city could exist without losing its stability over time. Before the visible walls, the mountain had to be prepared from within. That meant cutting away unstable sections, filling weak areas, compacting materials, and creating bases capable of supporting the structures above. Much of that work remained hidden beneath terraces, paths, and enclosures. That is why it often goes unnoticed when our eyes focus only on the architecture at the surface. But this is exactly where Machu Picchu reveals one of its most sophisticated aspects. The builders did not simply use the slope. They transformed it into a stable, draining foundation. That preparation required knowledge of the land, the incline, and the movement of water. Before it became a city of stone, Machu Picchu was a mountain carefully reconfigured so it would not give way. The most astonishing aspect of Machu Picchu may not be in the visible walls, but in the hidden system supporting them. Beneath the surface, there were prepared layers designed to drain water, distribute loads, and reduce the risk of instability on an extremely demanding slope. That changes the central question of the site. The great achievement was not simply building structures at high altitude. It was turning the mountain itself into a reliable foundation for an entire city. Terraces, foundations, and internal fill materials work together to keep the surface stable over time. In other words, Machu Picchu's main engineering is hidden, and that is exactly what makes the complex so extraordinary. The most famous part of the city depends on an infrastructure that almost never reveals itself at first glance. Once we understand the internal structure of the site, the importance of drainage becomes even clearer. At Machu Picchu, water could be just as dangerous as the slope itself. If it accumulated, it would increase pressure in the soil, weaken foundations, and put the structures at risk. That is why the design had to allow controlled infiltration and efficient runoff without saturating the hillside. The terraces and internal layers help do exactly that. Instead of trying to block the rain, the city's engineering guided water safely through the landscape. That is one of the secrets behind the site's survival. Machu Picchu did not endure in spite of water. It endured because it was built to live with it. The mountain remained wet, but the city learned how to drain. At Machu Picchu, Water was not only a danger to be controlled, it was also part of the complex's daily operation. Channels and fountains showed that the water supply was integrated into the urban design and into movement between sectors. Gravity was used to guide the flow through carefully planned routes along the mountain. That required precision, because on sloping ground, any deviation could cause erosion or waste. At the same time, water organized in this way made the site more livable. It did not appear as something separate from the architecture, but as part of the system itself. At Machu Picchu, hydraulics, terrain, and daily use were all connected. The city had to drain well when it rained and function well when water was used every day. The precision of Inca masonry should not be seen only as aesthetic refinement. In a region subject to earthquakes, the careful fit between stones also had structural value. Well-adjusted blocks distributed forces more effectively and could respond with greater flexibility to small movements in the ground. That helps explain why so many Andean structures survived for so long. At Machu Picchu, stability came from the combination of precise fit, a well-prepared base, and adaptation to the terrain. The stone did not work alone, but as part of a larger system. The famous fit between the blocks had a practical purpose in the harsh conditions of the mountain. That is why the masonry should be understood less as a mystery and more as an intelligent response to a difficult seismic environment. The internal organization of Machu Picchu shows that the site had distinct sectors connected in meaningful ways. Some areas are often interpreted as residential, others as ceremonial, and still others as routes for movement between different levels of the mountain. These parts do not appear scattered at random. They are linked by passageways, stairways, and changes in elevation that organize movement through the complex. That strengthens the idea of overall planning. Each sector seems to occupy a coherent position within a larger logic of use and circulation. On narrow, sloping ground, that distribution was essential to the functioning of the site. Machu Picchu was not just a cluster of buildings. It was a mountain city where location, access, and purpose had to work in balance. The landscape around Machu Picchu was not just a backdrop. It was part of the design itself. The mountain ridge, the deep valleys, the lines of sight, and the presence of the great peaks all help explain both the form and the meaning of the site. That is why the city is so striking when seen from a distance. It seems to rise out of the mountain because it was placed in dialogue with it. Walls, terraces, and platforms follow natural contours, instead of imposing a geometry foreign to the land. That integration increases stability and reinforces the site's visual identity. At Machu Picchu, architecture and landscape form a single composition. The complex does not dominate the mountain from the outside in. It seems to have been designed from the conditions of the Andean ridge itself. Even in such an extreme place, Machu Picchu had to function day by day. That involved movement between sectors, use of the terraces, access to water, and constant maintenance of the structures. At high altitude, simple tasks demand more effort, and mountain weather leaves little room for carelessness. That is why the site's daily operation depended on ongoing organization and attention. Stairways, channels, passageways, and platforms reveal that the city was designed to be used, not merely admired. The stability of the entire complex also required regular care. Machu Picchu brought together monumentality and routine in the same space. That is one reason for its historical impact. The complex was not only symbolic, it also had to answer, every single day, the practical demands imposed by the Andean terrain. Building in a place like this also carried obvious political and symbolic value. Raising such an organized complex on a ridge so difficult to reach demonstrated the ability to mobilize labor, master techniques, and control territory. At the same time, the relationship with the mountain and the landscape reinforced important dimensions of the Andean world. Machu Picchu brought together engineering, elevated position, and ceremonial presence in a single project. That is why it can be understood not only as a functional work, but as a visible statement of authority and knowledge. Its very existence communicated power. The city showed that it was possible to transform a hostile environment into something ordered, habitable, and enduring. In that sense, Machu Picchu was also a message built in stone on the mountain itself. The occupation of Machu Picchu was relatively brief. With the collapse of Inca power in the 16th century, the complex lost the function that had sustained its existence in that historical context. This process does not have to be imagined as a sudden disappearance. It is more plausible to understand it as a gradual emptying out during a time of major political change. With less movement, less support, and less maintenance, the city began to lose its central role. Even so, its structure remained firm. That reveals the strength of the original design. Even when use declined, the foundation built to confront water, slope, and time kept working. The abandonment of Machu Picchu does not erase its engineering. On the contrary, it helps show how the site was able to survive, even after it stopped fulfilling its original purpose. After abandonment, the mountain reclaimed the space. Vegetation, moisture, rain, and mist began to cover paths, terraces, and enclosures that had once been used every day. Even so, many walls and platforms remained standing. That shows that Machu Picchu's resilience did not depend only on the appearance of its walls, but on the quality of the adaptation between construction and terrain. The landscape took back the surface, but it did not fully destroy the structural logic of the site. The city was hidden, not erased. Terraces kept holding the slope, and the internal preparation of the soil continued supporting the whole. The mountain recovered the visible space, but the engineering remained active. That quiet survival is one of the strongest proofs of Machu Picchu's technical sophistication. When Machu Picchu began drawing attention again in the early 20th century, the impact was immediate. This was not simply a set of ruins in a spectacular setting. What stood there was a vast, coherent, and technically sophisticated work in one of the most demanding geographies of the Andes. The rediscovery reopened questions about function, construction, and the organization of labor. It also drew attention to the fact that an achievement on this scale had remained hidden for so long. As the site was documented, its importance grew rapidly. Machu Picchu came to be seen as one of the great examples of ancient engineering in the Americas. The modern world began to understand that behind the monumental image was a construction system deeply integrated with the mountain. Even after decades of study, not everything about Machu Picchu can be treated as absolute certainty. There is a strong association with the period of Inca expansion and with the ruling elite, but the site's full purpose is still debated. Many scholars prefer to describe it as a complex with combined functions rather than reduce it to a single use. That caution matters because it avoids oversimplification. Machu Picchu's historical value does not depend on final answers for every detail. If anything, it grows when we recognize the site's complexity and the limits of what can be stated with confidence. Understanding Machu Picchu also means accepting the presence of open questions. That is part of a more precise and more honest reading of history. Machu Picchu's technical legacy goes far beyond the image of its precisely fitted walls. The site shows how architecture, drainage, circulation, soil retention, and adaptation to terrain can function as parts of a single system. Nothing there depends on one isolated solution. The result comes from the combination of several complementary responses to the mountain landscape. Terraces, channels, foundations, and masonry work together to guarantee stability and endurance. That is the city's great lesson. Machu Picchu is not extraordinary only because it was built at high elevation, but because it transformed a difficult slope into a habitable and lasting structure. Its engineering still matters because it demonstrates something essential. Good construction begins, above all, with a deep understanding of the environment. Today, Machu Picchu is admired around the world, but it also requires constant care to remain preserved. The challenge now is no longer only explaining how the city was built on such a difficult ridge in the Andes. It is making sure the site stays stable under the pressure of the present, the climate, and the human flow across a fragile landscape. Its strength comes from a delicate balance between terrain, structure, and controlled use. That balance allowed the city to endure for centuries.
This video is an AI historical reconstruction based on records from the period, created for educational and narrative purposes.
Now it has to be protected. Perhaps Machu Picchu's greatest lesson is this: the mountain was not conquered, but understood. And perhaps today's greatest challenge is no longer explaining how it was built. It is making sure this partnership between engineering and landscape remains standing in the future.